Hey everyone, I hope you had a safe and healthy spring break. What I want to do briefly here is just give you a summary slash preview of what you're going to be reading from Kierkegaard for this week's readings. Some of you heard this prior to spring break. The Friday prior to spring break, I discussed what I'm about to say with some of the students that came to class. A lot of you were not in class that Friday, so I wanted to go ahead and give you just a brief preview of some of what you're going to be reading for this week from Kierkegaard. And I should say I don't know if I'm going to be posting these videos every week, but I think it would be helpful for this week. So Kierkegaard was an existentialist writer similar to Jean-Paul Sartre, although he actually wrote prior to him in the 19th century. Sartre makes a distinction in existentialism as a humanism between atheistic existentialists and Christian existentialists. So it's not necessary to be an atheist to be an existentialist. And so Kierkegaard was a Christian existentialist. And indeed, Kierkegaard actually argues that the highest form of human existence is the religious existence. Now, I'll say more about that next week when you guys read Fear and Trembling, which is specifically about what Kierkegaard calls the religious existence. But this week, you're going to be reading from a text titled Either or, and you're going to be reading a small excerpt from this larger work titled Either or. The first set of readings for today and Wednesday were titled Crop Rotation, and they are specifically about what Kierkegaard calls the aesthetic existence. Now, let me say a bit more just about the title Either or. Either or specifically represents a choice. So Kierkegaard is putting in front of you with the title of this book a choice that you, the reader, have to make, whether you want to pursue the aesthetic existence or the ethical existence. And so it's really being put in front of you as the reader. Kierkegaard is not telling you which of these two existences is preferable or better. But he starts by describing what he calls the aesthetic existence. Now, the aesthetic existence is simply a kind of existence that one pursues if they are interested in pursuing pleasure above all else. That is to say that what gets them out of bed in the morning, what keeps them going every day, is simply getting pleasurable objects, whether that be food, whether that be drinks, whether that be sex, whatever it might be. The pleasure seeker or the aesthetic person wants pleasure. That is what defines their existence. That is what makes their existence meaningful. Now, a problem arises that Kierkegaard is going to describe in this essay titled Crop Rotation, which has to do with the fact that eventually the pleasure seeker will get bored. And the one thing above all that the pleasure seeker wants to avoid is boredom. And so why does boredom arise for the pleasure seeker? Well, boredom arises because it's in the very nature of pleasure that once you get the thing that you want, it stops satisfying you and you want to get it all over again. It is in the very nature of pleasure that it is finite, that it will not last forever. And so what you end up doing is maybe one day you are really hungry. You're hungry every day. Maybe one day what gives you pleasure is food. And so that's what you do that whole day. You keep eating and eating and eating. But eventually you get bored with that. You say, I don't want to just eat. I have to eat, but I don't only want to eat. So I want another kind of pleasure. So you find something else to do. And then that gets boring and you find something else to do. And so the perpetual problem of the pleasure seeker is that they keep having to switch objects from what gives them pleasure. So they are, in a sense, dependent on the world out there. As opposed to taking responsibility for their existence, they're fundamentally passive to whatever kind of pleasure comes along in any given moment. And so what the pleasure seeker needs is a method to overcome boredom, because it's the one thing that they want to avoid above all else. And so what Kierkegaard is providing in this reading titled Crop Rotation is a method for the pleasure seeker to avoid boredom. So what is crop rotation? Why does he call it crop rotation? Well, he wants to think of a method for the pleasure seeker to avoid boredom, which is analogous to how a farmer might go about planting crops. And so we can think of crop rotation as simply rotating different kinds of crops. That's one way to think about it. Or it's the idea that, let's say, you are in a situation where you really like the location and the field you're in, but you can't get crops to grow there. You can't get them to grow. So you decide to switch fields, and you're going to grow them in a different place instead. And you could keep doing that. You could keep switching the location. And you have decided that the location is what is prohibiting or preventing the crops from growing. But what you could do instead is decide to plant the crops differently. You could grow them differently. And so what you do instead is you change the way you're planting the crops, not where you're planting the crops. So at a certain point in the reading, Kierkegaard says that my method consists in the true method of rotation, which is a change in the method of cultivation, not a change in the field. And so how does this relate back to the pleasure seeker? Well, what Kierkegaard is saying is, instead of constantly switching the object of your pleasure, what you do is you take up a different relation to the object of your pleasure. And so, for example, in class, on Friday, what came up was, well, maybe you really like to drink, but you get tired of drinking the same thing all the time. So you're drinking water, and you're drinking water, and you're drinking water, but you get tired of water, so you want to switch to something else. But instead, what could you do? Well, you could perhaps drop a little flavor packet in the water. So now you haven't switched the object, but in fact, you have related to the object in a different way. And so now the water is new and exciting. It's more meaningful to you, but you haven't had to switch. And so now you're no longer bored. So now you have taken up a different relation to the object. It's an internal relation to the object rather than an external relation, because an external relation would be one in which you switch the object all the time. Whereas the internal relation is you're stopping and you are reflecting upon how you as a person can take up a different relation to the object. So that, in short, is what's going on in crop rotation. Now, for Friday's reading, you're going to be switching gears and reading about another kind of existence that Kierkegaard calls the ethical existence. The ethical existence for Kierkegaard represents a higher form of existence. It's for somebody who has decided that the aesthetic existence is no longer worth their time, and they want something more out of life. That even with the method of rotation, somebody who now is actually being what Kierkegaard calls a reflective pleasure seeker, which is to say not merely somebody who is drug along by momentary objects, but in fact has decided to reflect upon how to relate to the object using the method of rotation. Even that is unsatisfying, and so now they want something else. So the ethical existence is what Kierkegaard defines by somebody who, above all, wants commitment. That this represents somebody who is potentially, you might think of as more responsible. Somebody who is willing to, for example, get married or have children or get a job or have meaningful relationships. Maybe this one just sounds appealing, more appealing on its face. That you can't imagine doing the aesthetic. This just sounds like something that's more appealing. And so the ethical person kind of looks at the aesthetic person and says, you are irresponsible, you're immature, and you need to figure out how to make your life more meaningful by finding things that are more meaningful in themselves, not simply pleasure. And so commitment is, for the ethical person, what pleasure was for the aesthetic person. Their life is defined by finding increasingly higher levels of commitment. And so what Kierkegaard's kind of doing here is kind of thinking, he's putting these two in front of you, and he's thinking about how would the aesthetic person sort of critique the ethical person, and how would the ethical person critique the aesthetic person. And it has to do all with how is it that you're pursuing that existence. You can either pursue it reflectively, or you can pursue it unreflectively. So you could be an ethical person who makes commitments. You get a job, you get married, you have kids, you have meaningful relationships. You could do that unreflectively, which is to say, you don't actually think about whether the commitments you're making will make you happy. You simply do them because that's what's expected of an ethical person. Somebody who's a responsible adult, grows up, gets married, has kids, all of the things that are expected of you. The aesthetic person would look at the ethical person and say, wow, that's really freaking boring. Are you actually considering whether that would make you happy? And the ethical person might take the time then to reflect and say, no, I don't want to become an aesthetic person again, but I do actually want to think about whether my commitments I'm making are making me happy. And then I'm not just kind of going through the motions of being an ethical person. And so you can also be a reflective ethical person. So at this point, we basically have 4 different levels of existence for Kierkegaard. We've got the unreflective aesthetic pleasure seeker, who simply pursues different kinds of pleasure all the time and gets bored. We've got the reflective pleasure seeker, who uses the method of rotation. We've got the unreflective ethical person, who is moved by making commitments but doesn't actually reflect on whether those commitments make them happy. And then we've got the reflective ethical person, who is able to take time and think about whether the commitments they want to make are going to make them happy. So in all, for Kierkegaard, existentialism is about thinking about different modes of existing. As you move through life, you are existing within a kind of particular existence. And that is what he's trying to describe with these. And I think it's not that difficult to relate to each of these. It's not to say that you will either always be aesthetic or always be ethical. You will find yourself torn between the two throughout your life. And that is what Kierkegaard is trying to describe. That human existence, for Kierkegaard, is a kind of struggle. It's to be pulled between different tensions. And human existence is about negotiating those different tensions in your life. That's what human existence is for him. Now, for Kierkegaard, ultimately, the religious existence is going to be a higher form of existence than the aesthetic or the ethical. And that's what you're going to be reading about next week in Fear and Trembling, where he's going to say that even the ethical existence, because at the end of the day, the ethical existence is marked by finite commitments. Having children, well, they won't live forever. Getting a job, the job won't last forever. Getting married, the relationship won't last forever. Eventually you'll die. And so human beings are trying to express some part of themselves that yearns for something that lasts forever. But not when they die. They don't want to, go and live in heaven where that lasts forever. Kierkegaard is not concerned with that. He says we have this part of ourselves that wants to express something infinite here and now. And religion is going to provide us with a way to do that. I'll talk more about that next week, but what I wanted to do in this brief video is at least give you what the aesthetic and the ethical existence looks like, so you at least have some framework to make sense of what you're reading. And if you have any questions, you can let me know, but hopefully this at least gives you some context for what you're going to be reading, and I will see you all in the next video. Take care, and please be safe and healthy.